And we discover the civilized aspect of that religion, which we know of in the Western world as Christianity, taking place, of course, at the year 1. Now, we find that's of no importance to us, except that everybody who writes a date out here is talking about the man we're talking about. When he puts down AD, and when he puts down BC, we are dating our very calendar from this incident I am discussing here. The principles known as Buddhism included those, of course, of love thy neighbor, abstain from the use of force. These principles appeared in Asia Minor at the beginning of our own dates. And I'm not, by the way, now discounting even vaguely the work of Christ or Christ himself or anything like that. Traditionally, Christ is supposed to have studied in India. This is traditional. One doesn't hear of him until he's 30 years of age. And he was a carpenter and so on. One hears a lot of things, but he also hears this persistent legend that he had studied in India. Well, this would, of course, be a very, very acceptable fact in view of the fact that the basic philosophy about which he was talking was a philosophy which had been extant in India at this time for about 500 years, a little less than 500 years. So it was about time that it moved out of that area, having taken over by that time 2/3 of the earth's populace. Now we are talking about love thy neighbor. We're talking about be civilized. We're talking about use no force. But at the same time, we are talking straight out of the mouth of Moses. So we evidently are at a crossroads of two philosophies. But these two philosophies are both the philosophies of wisdom. Now, the Hebrew definition of Messiah is one who brings wisdom, a teacher, in other words. Messiah is from messenger. But he is somebody with information. And Moses was such a one. And then Christ became such a one. He was a bringer of information. He never announced his sources. He spoke of them as coming from God. But they might just as well have come from the God talked about in the hymn to the Dawn Child, who, by the way, is rather hard to distinguish from gods talked about later on. He's certainly not the Hebrew God, the God the Christians worshipped. He looks more like that one talked about in the Veda. Now here we have a great teacher in Moses. We have other messiahs, and we then arrive with Christ. And the words of Christ were a lesson in compassion, and they set a very fine example to the Western world compared to what the Western world was doing at that moment. What were they doing at that time? They were killing men for amusement. And when this Christianity was interpreted and imported into Europe, there was considerable speculation and resurgence and an enormous amount of hope. The very same thing that the Buddhists hoped for became the hope, and this is what is very interesting, became the hope of the Christian world. Emancipation from the body. The survival and immortality of the human soul. Now, the use of Christianity was to produce a certain civilized state. And many people would blackguard Christianity by saying it reduced people down to a very low level indeed. This is not true. It took an entire world of slaves and it made freemen out of them. This in itself was quite a gain. It took a world which worshipped exclusively force and matter, and made it recognize that sooner or later one would have to turn to the fact that he had a soul. Now, remember that Christianity, in its basic wisdoms and so forth, is still available to us in the New Testament, and that this is really, no matter how it has come through the line, is quickly and swiftly traceable back to the Veda. We have a consistent track, in other words, here. This track is very consistent. The same messages coming through. The Christian God is much better characterized in the Vedic hymns than in any subsequent publication, including the Old Testament. The Old Testament doesn't make near as good a statement of what the Christians think of as God as the Veda.